My name is Tim McLaughlin, and I wanted to kind of do this in kind of three quick parts. The first, I kind of want to introduce myself and the story and stuff like that, and then talk a bit about the publishing because I do a non-standard type of publishing, and then after that, get more into detail in the story itself, and maybe pause for questions or discussion after each of those bits. So as I said, my name is Tim McLaughlin. I live right down the street here on New Ipswich. My wife and some of my kids are here. And I spend my time, writing and preaching. I'm in school to be a Baptist pastor and working down over in Townsend. And you may know me as a library trustee, or if you don't know me, it's because we just moved to Ashby in 2019. And so the pandemic significantly impacted our ability to meet the people of Ashby. But originally I'm from Western PA, in a town called Sharon, which is part of what's now the Rust Belt. It was a steel town that, the steel industry left, and that influenced a lot of my kind of aesthetic and the way that I view things. There's a lot of urban decay kind of around where I grew up. And there's kind of this blend of Appalachian spirituality and ideas and Midwestern folklore that comes together in that area. And so I grew up in that environment, and that influenced a lot of kind of how I view the world and how I describe things. In October of 2004, I took a vacation to Chicago. And while I was there, I ended up having kind of this experience, this vision involving this ghost that was said to be residing in one of the bathrooms. And this girl who was living in the apartment at the time, who was a witch, claimed to have been in communication with her. Like, she claimed to have been trying to communicate with this ghost for a while, and so we talked about that a fair bit. And this wasn't like the first or last encounter I've had in my life that could be probably accurately described as supernatural. It wasn't even the first or last on that trip, but that one stuck with me for a bit. And a few weeks later, I ended up having a dream about a fictionalized version of that event. And I got curious about kind of the characters in that dream, and I started to explore that, and I started to write stuff out and map out this whole story. And it took a lot of years and trying out couple different forms like webcomics or novel or whatever to try to figure out the best way that what format this story really belonged in, where it lived. And ultimately, as I fleshed it out and as the tone settled, it became apparent that this was a story with elements of both paranormal horror and urban fantasy. The core difference between those is basically focus and the nature of the supernatural. So in paranormal horror, you have a lot of ghosts and witches and vampires and things like that, where the main threat is that the unknown is coming to get you. There are things out there that you don't understand that mean you harm, and it focuses a lot on the people who go and fight those things. And it can happen in basically any setting, but usually tends to be a rundown version of that setting. So if it's in a city, it's kind of the abandoned parts of the city. If it's in a building, it's an abandoned building. It's things like that. Whereas urban fantasy takes standard fantasy elements like elves and gods and fae and puts them into the modern day, and it hides them. Urban fantasy relies a lot on the supernatural being hidden in the shadows of the mundane. And it talks a lot about the people who cross from one world to the other and kind of explore these differences. And urban fantasy, basically as a rule, is set within a city context, usually within the last 100 years. So Tall Tales incorporates both. It has ghosts, it has witches, it has fae, it has gods. A lot of it takes place in my hometown area, so you have this Rust Belt, which is this city setting, but a very kind of running down city setting, or this rural setting that's kind of surrounding it. And the stories themselves, Tall Tales is composed of a series of short stories. And each one has varying focus, and so some of them are more horror, some of them are more fantasy. And in 2018, what I decided to do with it was to do a serial fiction and epistolatory format. Epistolatory is similar to Dracula in that it's letters and in-world documents and things like that. This story is told mostly through blog format. And those blogs tell various short stories. So throughout Tall Tales, here's this short story, it's a self-contained narrative, that then ties into a larger story as they're all connected to each other through similar characters, through similar situations, through stuff like that. So technically the Tall Tales books aren't novels, they're collections, because they're collections of short stories, but they tell one large story the way a novel does. These short stories mostly focus on, they follow a paranormal investigator who's immune to magic, a Catholic priest hunting a cult, a witch that's seeking to understand the nature of magic, a biology student discovering her connection to the supernatural, and a few others as they kind of are moving towards this common fate that they're all bound towards. And it includes folklore and myths that are being folded into the larger narrative. In the books, there's a story called The Devil's Church and another one called the Venusberg, which are each just tales that already exist in the real world. The Devil's Church is a bit of folklore from back home. The Venusberg is a bit of folklore from Germany. And I borrow elements like Hecate. Hecate, being from Greek mythology, is a recurring character throughout Tall Tales. Each of those characters that I mentioned has their own goals and their own stories, and these play into all of this, but I'm gonna dive into that more when I get into the actual story. But that's kind of the big picture of what Tall Tales is this collection of short stories that are urban fantasy and paranormal horror that go through and tell this much larger story when they're all put together. So that's kind of the introduction section. So I want to open up if anyone has any questions or comments about it so far. I can't see the YouTube thing, so I don't know if that's supposed to be available for...
Oh, I think it's
switched
away,
tab.
yeah.
Okay,
there you go.
So if there's just anybody chatting, I wouldn't know.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, yeah, so does anyone have any questions or thoughts about kind of that big picture stuff?
Yeah, did you mentioned that you were interested in different formats, and was that more exploratory? Did you like start publishing in different formats like webcomics or like?
It was largely exploratory.
Yeah.
So the very first thing I tried to do was a webcomic with a friend of mine named Alex. And so he was drawing and I was writing, and we were working through, we actually did come up with a lot of material. He drew a lot of comics and a lot of character designs and all this other stuff, and I mapped out a lot of storylines that I ended up continuing to use in later formats. But we never put any of it online. We never did anything with it. I tried Tall Tales. It was called Madison PI at the time. It wasn't called Tall Tales because it was just about the one character. But I tried Madison PI in a few different formats. Like I tried to write it as a book and I didn't like it as a standard novel. I tried to do things like that, and none of it ever came to fruition. I just knew that they didn't quite fit, and so it took a while. But it was exploratory.
Was it tough to get into? I forget the word that you used. Epistolary?
Epistolary. Yeah. So I didn't know. I full confession. In high school, when we were supposed to read Dracula, I just didn't. And so that was the one test in high school that I cheated on was that one. So I didn't entirely know that this was a thing that existed. But I started writing it. When I started writing it and doing this, my wife was like, "This reads like Dracula. Like, you should look into that." And so when I looked into that, I found out that this, epistolatory was a thing. But actually getting into it was fairly natural for me. Like I decided, okay, I'm going to do this in first person, and I started doing it in first person. And I was like, oh, if I'm going to do that, I should like have it be letters and records from in-world and all this other stuff, and that would be great, and that would be cool. And it seemed like a cool idea that I thought I had heard about, like that other people had done. I didn't think it was a fully original idea, but I didn't have any concrete examples in mind. But when I started doing it, then my wife was like, yeah, this is a thing. Like, one of the most famous books in the world does it. And so.
It's funny how karma kind of got you.
Right.
By cheating on that test.
Yeah.
You could have been more efficient in your process.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And there was things like, I didn't actually know it was horror at first. Like, when I was writing it, I was thinking, oh, these stories are fantasy. Like, I'm writing them urban fantasy, and so I was doing that. And people were reading it and be like, there's some scary stuff in here. Like someone was reading the first few stories on the website, and they were like, there's this sense of dread that's just kind of there all the time. And I was like, that's a horror description. And so I went to a friend of mine who is a librarian, and I was like, hey, can you read a couple of these stories and tell me if there's horror elements here? Should I be warning people, hey, this is urban fantasy with horror elements? And she came back, she was like, no, this is horror. Like, that's what that is. So there was a lot of that type of thing where it's like my lack of research beforehand really caught up to me pretty quickly.
Now, are they like gory horror or just sort of psychological horror?
Yeah, so they are, as I understand it, because I end up having to learn a lot about horror after that conversation, they would be classified as cosmic horror. So it's not so much that there's, like H.P. Lovecraft and stuff like that, so there's not so much the, okay, this is all in your head, like psychological horror, and it's not so much the, okay, this is all blood and gore and stuff like that. Actually, there's very little violence that's on screen. But it's very, there are things out there. The world is a lot darker place than you realize, and there are things out there that make everything you know about the world a little bit wrong. And when you start butting up against that, it creates a lot of problems, and the human mind isn't really capable of handling it. And so that's kind of, it ends up flowing much more in that direction, as far as types of horror go. But yeah, like I said, there's very few characters that actually, like, you see them die, or things like that. It tends to be very much like you get all the setup, or you get all the, this happened, but you're seeing the effects and the results and the things that people are exploring that lead them to those places. All right. So the second part was publishing. I want to talk a little bit about the publishing process. Because of all this, because it's not really, it's somewhere between a novel and a collection, and I was trying to do, kind of these various stories, various different stories with these different perspectives and everything, I ended up going with a split model. And the first part of that is the online serial. So I started publishing it in late 2018 online as serial fiction, which is very much where you take the story and you tell it in pieces over time. This used to be a much more common model, like Charles Dickens. I think all of his books were written originally as serials in magazines, bit by bit, and he got paid by the word, which explains a lot about Charles Dickens. And you went through and you would have to tune in each time to get the new magazine, get the new thing or whatever, to continue the story. And so that format has kind of faded out of the limelight. But I felt that the internet provided a great opportunity to bring it back, and it seemed like a natural fit for this story. And so what I started to do was write it as blogs. And so each part of the story was a blog post on these blogs on the website. And so as you work through, like you'd get an update every week from each blog, and then a second blog was added. And okay, now you get 2 story bits each week, but they're different stories. And by the end of volume 2, I had 5 blogs going. So you were getting 5 posts a week, but it was from 5 different perspectives. And, that was a bit tricky to keep up with, but, it did. I'm not doing that currently. I stopped doing that as kind of the intro to volume 3. I did the very beginning of volume 3, just a couple storylines to kind of tease it, and then I phased that out. Because it hasn't been the focus that readers have gone for. But all the stuff that I did put up is still there. It's a complex reading structure doing it that way. And I haven't found any other serials that are doing quite what I did. There's actually a lot of web serials online. There is actually a whole serial fiction movement happening online right now that I didn't know about when I started out, but I was very excited to find as I dug further. But they tend to be one perspective, one story, and you get updates with some regularity. And so the problem that I was having is that when I was telling 5 different points of view, 5 different stories in a serial format, it got very tricky for people to keep up with. And I think that's part of why the serial format, people had trouble with it in terms of readership and stuff like that. I do still kind of feel like it was the best way to tell the story, the way that I had structured it, but it was overly difficult on readers. And this came up with my wife, and a couple people were asking me, like, what's the reading order? Like, how should I be reading this? Where do I start? How do I figure out where to go next? And I would tell people, well, you know, you can start at, pick a blog and read through it, or you can start here, you can start here. And my wife was like, no. Give people a reading order. Like, give them a structure, give them somewhere to start, and then a sequence to go through. And I hesitantly did do that. So if you go now to talltalesuf.com, there's a link that says start here, or you can just put /start. And that'll take you to a little page with a quick video where I explain kind of what's going on, and then a button that says next. And if you just keep clicking those next buttons, you'll work through every single post on the website in a set order. And that means that you'll be bouncing between blogs, and you'll be bouncing between perspectives, but it'll read much more like a book does, because you're just going through and, okay, now we're getting this whole short story, and now we're getting this whole short story, and go bit by bit through. So that's now there on the website, and has been for about a year. So that's available, but the thing that my wife was still kind of mad at me because it's not the same order as the book. So,
Why do you have two different orders?
I didn't think about it.
Okay.
When I was sitting down and doing the book, I organized it in a way that I felt worked for the book. And when I was organizing on the website, I sat down and I organized it in a way that I felt worked for the website. And afterwards, my wife was like, why is it not the same order? And I was like, I don't know. It didn't feel right. And I didn't think about the fact that I'd already picked an order for the book when I picked this order. So I just did that. And so, yeah,
do you
it's...
have another reading order in mind?
Huh?
Do you have, or not order, but do you have like a reading experience in mind that isn't linear?
Yeah, so, well, none of them are linear. They're broadly, like, kind of the main plot, I guess, is in chronological order, but a lot of the events, like a lot of the stories in it, aren't. And so there's stories that take place in like 1400 something that is, I think, the first post you read on the website, but like the third story you read in the book. And, you know, there's just kind of different things like that where not all of it actually happens in sequence or in order. And so none of it is linear necessarily, but there are other ways that I think are worth reading it. Like, one of the ways that I encourage people to do is to pick a character, because there's these 5 blogs and 4 of them are written by individuals in world, sort of. And pick a character, start at the beginning of their blog, and just read their story. And there's structures in place to allow you to do that. And I think that would be an interesting experience for people. But again, that's not the reading order that was imposed on the website as a whole.
Right.
So
When you started posting them on the website, had you written them all, or were you writing them as you were posting them?
I was writing them as I was posting them, and there was a number of bad ideas involved in that. As I got deeper into it, I got more and more structured, like planning out. Before I started writing by the time I got to where I was writing volume 3, I didn't write anything until I had the whole thing mapped out. I knew what post was going to go up on what day and how it was going to play into the book and everything like that. And so I gradually did that. At its height, I was writing things about a month before they went on the website. But when I started, I had a few weeks worth of posts, but it was only one blog at the time. A few weeks worth of posts written. And then by the time I launched the second blog, I had a couple of those written. But I was writing as it was going up.
Yeah.
So
That's hard if you get writer's block.
yeah, so I suffer from chronic migraines. And so every once in a while, it would just go on a hiatus. I just have to post, like, I can't think right now, and writing isn't happening. And it would just, nothing would post for a month or two. Because then I was, it's okay, the time to deal with the headache and recover and then write some more so that when I start, I'm not publishing it right now. So that would happen. And I actually took a year off at one point where I said, I'm just going to write as much as I can for the next bit ahead of time so that this doesn't keep happening. but yeah, it was tricky. It was very difficult trying to keep up with it, and I should have learned that lesson when I was doing a webcomic, but somehow I didn't. So.
Did you have readers that were like after you, like you hear about the readers after the author of Game of Thrones who like stalk him at
Right.
coffee shops and are like, when are you gonna, they feel like they're at a cliffhanger and they need to be.
There are a couple people who come back to me fairly frequently, like, when is the next bit coming? Like, I need to know what happens next. There's a couple people that do that, yeah. One of them I see at conventions, almost every convention we go to, and so the fact that I'm not doing conventions this year, I feel like I'm going to hear about that next year. So that was one of the streams where I was doing the online channel, the online serial, and then I decided to self-publish the books. I was taking each kind of broad section of it that I had split it into, in my head, 5 volumes. And so each volume, when I complete it, I then put it into a book, was what I did with volumes 1 and 2. I'm focusing on the books now, for 3 through 5. But I decided to self-publish for a couple reasons. There's 3 kind of main streams in publishing. There's traditional publishing, which is what people think of. Oh, you get an agent, your agent pitches it to a publisher, it goes to Simon & Schuster or Penguin, Random House or whatever. And that's traditional publishing. It's a very dynamic market going on there, and there's a lot of issues happening with it right